Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SG Explained. I'm one of your hosts, Elliot, and today with me is the whole team. We have Rovik.
Hello.
And Mr. Willie.
Hi, guys.
I'm back from hiatus.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
How was serving the nation?
Oh, well, it was great. Yeah, I got to see a lot of things.
Right. Weren't you out in like Japan or something? Or weren't you like trekking the Antarctics? What were you doing?
What?
Must have been a pretty big thing for you to have not been on this podcast.
For about a month.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was serving the nation, helping out in the National Day Parade for 2019.
Right.
So
Go Singapore.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it was a resounding success. I seen it myself. I'm really proud of the work.
Right. You saw people coming together across differences, across races.
Do you see them do the Kallang Wave or not?
Oh, of course. I mean, I have to see like every single Saturday.
Did you see our Kallang Wave? The fact that the smallest Kallang Wave ever.
The two-man Kallang Wave. It was me and Rovik. It was damn good. It was damn good.
I sort of like had it in my mind. I was like imagining.
Yeah, thanks, man. All right, today, guys, we have a monster of a topic that we're going to talk about today. It's going to be really fun and serious. I mean, fun and serious.
It can be both.
It can be both. And today's topic is none other than racism.
Yeah, and not just racism. We're not going to be trying to accuse anyone of racism.
Oh, no, of course not.
I think with this, the whole goal when we were thinking about this was how do we talk about racism in Singapore. And you know, for those who are listening to last week's episode, we did share this, but we've actually wanted to do this episode at this time for a long time.
Yes, we have.
But you know, if you've also been watching the news, you realize that there was a very interesting saga that just unfolded with, you know, the EPay saga, as they call it in the media sphere.
Yep.
Where, you know, Elliot, do you want to give a short description of what that saga was?
All right. So about a month ago, there was a ad done by Paymen SG, and it featured a MediaCorp artist, radio DJ Dennis Chew, and in it he plays characters. I mean, he is a character comic by training, and he plays characters from 4 different races. He plays Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others, like some Eurasian-looking dude, right?
It was ambiguous, yeah.
yeah. But so he brown-faced himself. So they made him look darker. And
well, not just brown face. He like wore a tudong.
Yeah, he wore a tudong in one, and also like the Indian character was stereotypically very Indian. Yeah. And that caused a bit of a hoo-ha amongst netizens. In particular, one Pretty Please and her brother. And they decided to make a rap video which accused, implicitly called all Chinese people racist. Even though, you know, their stance is that they didn't call all Chinese people racist. Yep. Just the people who made the ad.
Right.
And that sparked a lot of controversy because there was like police investigations. Even Shanmugam, our minister, he came out and said like, oh, you know, this is wrong. So the moment the government's involved, we're going to have like big hoo-has. And supposedly it started some conversations. We went back and forth. We had some satirical styles of apologies coming from Pretty Please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the whole thing about this that surprised me was that a lot of people were just starting to get warmed up to how to talk about these things. Right? Because it was a very tricky space. Like, actually, what was wrong about the ad, if anything was wrong at all, and, you know, what was wrong about the response? What was wrong with someone, you know, forming a satirical video and calling out something that they thought was wrong? Yeah.
So we are not going down that slope because it's a monster of a topic.
Of course it is.
Yeah, it's a monster of a topic, and even amongst themselves, I think we have like some really...
Willie, I remember we had a 3-hour conversation.
We had a 3-hour... when we prepared for this episode on Saturday, it was a very long conversation, even before I joined.
Yeah.
It's
true.
It is, yes. Nothing but truth.
It's true. Many car rides.
Yes.
Moving. I think we've been trying to get to this topic for the longest. I think we tried to consider this topic even in season 1, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was just really monstrous a topic.
Yep.
But I think right now we really cannot alienate this topic anymore. we absolutely, especially with this case of it blowing up with, I think with the minister, for example, as well as we have people online making, and of course this brown face ad as well. I think it's about right time that we actually talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, more extensively.
So I think it's important that if we do this, that we start with definitions.
Yep. Sure.
And I think that's important because, you know, people go around calling everyone a racist, but what is actually racism? I think that's useful to identify. And from what I've read online, there are actually two levels of racism. And quite broadly racism.
And these are broad strokes, of course.
Broad strokes.
I mean, we all know that there's a lot of different definitions out there. And just for the sake of this discussion that we're about to have,
right,
we're going to narrow it down to two.
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
Great.
So it all stems from prejudice, and prejudice starts with having an opinion or proclivity towards someone or something based on, held notions. And when that prejudice is based on race, then that is considered racism. So that could be any kind of antagonism directed against someone, or believe that someone is inferior just based on their race. So that is, one colloquial definition that a lot of us tend to use, and that really is at the individual level, right? But the other definition, and this is a more academic definition, right? So you'll see this used by sociologists, you'll see this being used when we want to think about institutional
racism. In the realm of like anthropological studies.
Yep. And so this is talking, so the first was individual level, this is talking about institutional and systems level. And this is saying racism is basically when this prejudice is institutionalized in hierarchies of societal power, where governments, corporations, and organizations are making choices that basically are trying to put people of other races down or oppress other people.
Okay.
And so, that is a much more sinister definition. They use that definition as a way to basically contrast against, just regular discrimination, which is at the individual level.
Right.
And actually saying that racism is a system of issues. And so, when a lot of people talk about racism, then it comes into the realm of like reverse racism and what is actually modern racism versus like casual racism. And a lot of these things are just derivations of these terms. But I think for our discussion, what we've agreed is we'll look at racism both in the individual level about how we treat each other, and then also at the societal level, we're thinking about power, thinking about structures, and actually how those have embedded certain practices over time.
Great. So just focus everything down. We have a main thesis for tonight. Okay.
Yep.
Our main thesis is, how do we, as people of Singapore, just talk to each other about racism? Like, what's going on? How do we start these conversations? We're not going to solve any problems. I know that's for sure. It's three guys sitting at a table, which not necessarily the best academic group of,
Well, you got one minority person here, right?
No, that's good. No, that's good.
That's Willie, the old guy.
Exactly.
So the demographic here is pretty much skewed right now, okay? But as a result, we're going to just try to confine this to ways that we deal with racism on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and the reason why this is an important episode for SG Explain is because race is pretty much key to who we are as a country.
Yes,
right?
it
We
is.
are a multiracial country. Multiracialism is in almost every part of our policy from,
in fact, multiracialism is something celebrated in the country as well.
Yeah, it's definitely one of our core pillars.
I'm coming up from National Day Parade, and you know what? One of the act's central performance is around these four different races as well in Singapore, right? And coming together and becoming a melting pot that defines Singapore.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, multiracialism is in our GRC system, group representative constituencies. It's in our housing policies. It's in our elected presidency. So the fact that a race factor is almost everywhere, then we can't escape talking about racism or the issue of race in our daily lives.
Sure.
And I mean, Willie, were you around? I'm sorry, I keep making these jokes, but were you around when the race riots happened? Because
whoa. I think we need to make this an ages discussion.
Yeah, man.
maybe we need to do an ageism episode. No, because I think in Singapore, if you talk about race long enough, it will always go back to the topic of the race riots, and this happened in 1964.
Yes.
Where basically the Malay people were holding a procession to celebrate, the birthday of Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, and there was a big riot between the Malay and the Chinese because people were saying that people were saying things, to incite violence, and there had to be a huge crackdown. And so these racial riots caused a lot of damage, a lot of hurt, and that has been one of, when we were in social studies class.
Yeah, they would always harp upon this, like it was ingrained in you from a young age.
Right, and so that is the fear, that we go to a state where people get so angry, where people get so violent that something like that happens. They even had to have a curfew.
Yeah, we don't want to go back to those dark days.
Yep.
Right.
And so today, I mean, honest to God, I don't think something like that is going to happen anytime soon. I think, even though we're trying to say like we can do better about talking about racism, I don't think we're at a place where there's so much pent up violence. But there is a need to continue talking about these things in a way that's productive, so that we never get there anyway.
Yeah, and we can, I mean, there are always ways to improve racial relations between us in Singapore.
Yep.
And even though one of the core tenets of religious harmony is tolerance, we kind of like talked about this the last time.
Yep.
One of the core principles is tolerance. Tolerance comes in many different forms, and I suppose every time we have these conversations, we talk about how can we better the relations between the races. It can only strengthen rather than worsen, and that's what we want to do.
Yep.
Right? Always find more nuanced ways of kind of like communicating with each other, our different practices, our different cultures, our different beliefs.
Yep. I'll tell you what's my personal goal.
Yeah.
In some ways, that we move past tolerance and into a realm where we can actually accept that different people, while having different views and different backgrounds, actually are valid, right? I think tolerance, to an extent, is saying, I understand your view and I understand you exist, and it may not be mine, but at the same time, I'm just gonna give that space for us to coexist. Whereas acceptance goes beyond and says, your view, your reality is also valid, and I'm gonna engage you on that level, right? And I think, to me, I'm gonna share stories, and I think all of us have stories prepared.
Yeah, that's today's episode is more of an anecdotal sharing session. Yeah, which is going to be, I guess, much more easier to like talk about at a level like it's more from our own hearts.
Yeah. So let's start. What stories do we have on the table that we kind of want to bring up as examples?
So I suppose everyone's looking at me, so I will begin, right? And I think being a person who actually runs a company, we definitely have racism at the workplace as well. And I think this is something that a lot of people, it's an area, workplaces actually like areas where you get to interact and to do something with different races, different people from different levels of society as well. So I think this is a very good place to start. So maybe I'll just cite a friend's story.
Okay.
Right,
Oh yeah.
Of what I think is like racism, which is there was this group of my friend, right? He is actually Indian. He goes into a meeting with I think called to his office. His boss asked him to go into the office, and he goes in this meeting, and everybody was speaking Chinese, right? And then he sits down and he tries to be part of that conversation, but unfortunately, everyone continued to speak Chinese even though he's around, and he, of course, he doesn't understand Chinese. In fact, one of the other colleagues actually turned around and asked him, "Hey, do you understand Mandarin?"
That's so much wrong with that.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah, and then he goes like, "No." But I think what was very distinct here was that he said that, "Can everybody speak English, please?"
Right.
And of course, in the end, what happened was that they continued to speak in Mandarin.
Okay.
And I think that's quite I think for some of our friends who are, for example, not part of the majority Chinese race, they can actually empathize or understand such a situation that they actually have.
Yeah.
And I think it would be great to actually try to understand from somebody else's points of view that people actually, how do I put it this way? Because you're so used to speaking in, for example, Mandarin, right? And then you actually alienate other races.
Yeah.
And then this becomes like systematic throughout society as well. And I think that can be quite a problem for people as well. I mean, of different kinds of races. Yeah.
This could to me, this seems a bit like casual racism, because I don't think there's a lot of ill intent when you sometimes, I don't know, man, like maybe I'm just guilty of it as well, where I'll be speaking Mandarin to a bunch of my friends because it's easier. Like some things are communicated easier when I use Mandarin as opposed to using English. But then, when you're engrossed in that conversation, you might forget or overlook the fact that someone else who doesn't understand your language is in the same room. Now, where it comes a little bit more, what I would say a bit more hardline about is if, let's say, the person raises it up and says, hey, sorry, I don't understand, like, clearly I don't understand Mandarin here. Could we please use the professional code of conduct to use English in Singapore?
Of course.
That's like just baseline why we speak English in general, so we all could work together.
Yep.
It's that point when you say like, hey, sorry, you remind everyone, can we speak English? And people continue to do so. That is a bit of a workplace issue.
Yeah. I mean, and I can also totally imagine the complexity of actually raising that up as a formal issue.
Yeah.
Right? So in this setting, your friend went up and engaged the people directly and said, can we try speaking English so that I can be a part of work because I'm getting paid?
Yeah, because I need to do my job, basically.
But then if no one does anything, then it becomes even more difficult because, what has to happen next, right? Does the person have to go to the boss and say, like, look, this is an actual issue. I need, I don't feel comfortable working at a place where I'm not involved. And the boss then has to go to the team and say, like, now we have to officially mandate that we speak English, and everyone's gonna be like, "Oh, boo! Like this guy just made everything like so weird,
awkward, right?" Yes.
But and then all the blame just comes on this person who never spoke the language that wasn't a professional code of conduct.
Right.
Yeah. So it becomes so tricky, and I mean, this to me, this example is great because I can empathize, being someone who doesn't speak Mandarin, and while that is something.
Oh, you don't? You don't speak
I can understand when you're bitching about me. I think we can say that.
I think that's because of the tone over here. It's never about the words; it's about the tone.
Yeah, I know, Willie. But I also think anyone who goes through the army learns the bare minimum that's necessary.
True.
But this is at work where I think there's some basis for.
This is about professional decorum as well.
Yeah, but it doesn't just stay at the workplace, right? So, even in outside of work, like there can be environments where, people, when we're talking about casual racism, I'm doing air quotes, sorry, podcast listeners. When casual racism.
We should have a sound just for that, yeah.
Air quotes. I'll record that later, then every time we do air quotes, I'll play. Air quotes.
Yeah. We're just going to record a whole bunch of things for you.
Just, yeah.
It goes into almost anything where, you walk into environments and and let's say it's not targeted at a specifically Chinese cultural thing, right? So I've been in environments where people will just start engaging in Mandarin, for example, at a restaurant, for example, and this is like a regular restaurant, not like a Chinese restaurant, right? And then you're like, well, what do I do now, right? Like, what is how do I navigate the fact that I am not being engaged at a fair level, right? And so now I have to walk around, and all of this just becomes very frustrating sometimes because as someone who cannot speak the language or someone who doesn't know a lot about, what it means to be Chinese, then sometimes it's an implicit block of access to things.
Right. Okay. I mean, so let's boil it down once again.
All right.
How do we talk about this?
Yeah.
I mean, between friends, right? Sometimes.
How do you talk to your colleagues as well?
Yeah.
Right?
How do you talk to people?
Clearly, Rovig has also said that what happens if you tell your boss, and then thereafter the boss comes down really hard on the team,
man,
and then go like, oh my, this guy just is like a total tattletale.
Yeah.
And then that's not really convenient.
Yeah.
How exactly should one person actually go about tackling such an issue?
I mean, not to be pedantic about this. I'm just saying from if I was guilty of that, and like my boss came to like, hey guys, all right, so we gotta address this elephant in the room.
Yeah.
You guys speak Chinese sometimes, it's normal for you all, but when it comes to workplace meetings, Like, let's all try to, speak the common language. I think the first things first, and I've been in situations where people have reacted otherwise, I think it's to not be defensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. To not be like, sorry. I mean, it's like that, second nature,
Yeah.
That's some of my colleagues previously. I mean, not the ones that you know, obviously.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you all know my colleagues,
Yes.
But none of them have been like
Sorry,
that.
Aaron and Janice.
Yeah, sorry. No, yeah, not outing you guys.
Air quotes.
Air quotes. Yeah, it's to not be defensive and just go like, acknowledge it. I guess you gotta listen.
Yep.
Step one. And then, I think the frankness or the ability to address something without investing too much feeling, like to not either be hyper offended or to be hyper defensive, I think is a good step forward. It kind of shows a sense of maturity.
Yep. So I'm hearing you say that you'll listen.
Yeah, I'll definitely listen.
Yeah.
Listening is important, and while you might feel uncomfortable about it, people generally feel uncomfortable when they're hearing something which might be foreign to them sometimes.
Right. And I think the main thing to realize about this is that no one's saying that, what you're doing is something that you intentionally were doing to malign someone, right?
Exactly.
Someone's just saying, look, you may not know this, but it's making me feel like I don't have a seat at this table. And so all I'm asking is just, I'm flagging this up. Maybe we try to be more inclusive about it.
Yeah.
And the response should be, okay, like, that's my blind spot. Thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah.
Right.
And just to further elaborate, like, it might not solve the problem immediately, right? Because these are humans we're talking about. We're going to do some mistakes a couple of times.
Right.
So at that level, I do agree that tolerance is important on both ends.
Yep.
You gotta agree that sometimes, like, okay, these people are going to take some time to adjust their what is second nature. And at the same time, every time you catch yourself doing something at that casual racism level, you gotta be like, okay, yeah, next time, definitely not. And just keep working at it.
Right.
Because I think one thing I learned from the Pretty Please saga was we can do better. That's as simple as it gets.
Yeah.
As simple as it gets.
So let's talk about the Pretty Please saga, right?
Oh,
so
dang.
let's actually talk about it.
Great.
Because I think what happened with that, what I found interesting about a lot of the responses that came out was a lot of people from mostly the Indian, but also a big chunk from the Malay community coming out and saying, like, it's not fair that we are represented this way, right? Like, across different forms of media, that you can just so easily put on our skin color and pretend to be as it, but still caricature us, right? And there are multiple examples of globally bad media representation of minority races and also darker races, actually, a lot of times, but also accents, also in terms of just the way that people behave. I know there was a big example in Singapore also where in one of Jack Neo's films they were doing an audition and they asked one of the guys to put on
to be more Indian, right?
I think to use an Indian accent, and really just pointing at, like, I don't want to do it for the podcast, but really that kind of like Indian accent that, even though it wasn't his accent, and so his response was, well, not every Indian speaks like this. How does it help the show, right? And there was that whole saga. So I mean, Elliot, you've been in media.
Yeah, this is where I'm time to shine. This Paymen SG saga, actually, I don't know if you guys know this, I was part of it as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
You were?
Yeah. Oh, well, okay, so there was
Were you one of Dennis Chu's?
No, I was not. Unfortunately, my name is Tan. Elliot Tan.
Yeah.
Not Dennis Chu, and I don't know the guy very well.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was this Twitter thread that came out as a response to this entire, like, Pretty Please saga. Okay? And inside, it tracked down multiple instances in our media history for the past decade where we've been either explicitly racist or implicitly racist. Unfortunately, there was one in 2012 or 2013 where I was explicitly racist.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, so you've been racist.
I've been racist, and I know I've called myself out multiple times.
Yeah.
So much so I had to write a Facebook post about this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I've seen this post.
So the post was like, I'm sorry. Yeah. But anyway, so what happened was in 2013, I was doing this YouTube video for Wa Banana called Types of People at Sentosa.
Yep.
Okay. And in one of them, one of the scenes, it was about building sandcastles. So people build sandcastles in on the beach. So I think I'm building a sandcastle, and I say, "Yay! I built a sandcastle!" And then Janice pops up the side. She wears a construction supervisor hat and says, "You call that a sandcastle?" She pulls out a blueprint. Aaron and I come up from the side, and we're wearing like brown paint all over our body.
You actually put paint on yourself.
Yeah. So I Dennis chewed before Dennis chewed.
Yeah.
Dennis chewed, you know.
And I'm not sure if that's something to be proud about.
I know I'm 100% not proud of this.
Right.
But so we did that, and the funny part about it, or rather the strange part about it, was that we got called out back then.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't blow up the way it blew up today.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Who called you out? Like,
I mean, like netizens. Some
Okay.
netizens called us out and said like, "Hey, you know, that's not right." But there was also a huge vocal majority on our channel. I think the video has been taken down already.
right.
A huge vocal majority on our channel who also said, you know, there's no intent. There's no
Right.
ill intent to make fun of like minorities. In this case, we were mimicking our Bangladeshi workers
Right.
who are in Singapore and they build most of our infrastructure these days.
Right.
So some people are like, you know, it was in jest, it's comedy, But I think that's a very complicated ground.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated ground.
Right.
On one
right.
hand, some of our defenders were saying, you know, the reality of Singapore is, yes, we do have Bangladeshi workers who build everything around us, and
And a very large majority of them.
a very large majority are Bangladeshi, and therefore they were pointing out that, you know, they are the best builders that we have, lah. But also the people who were against the video were saying, well, it doesn't give you the right to brown face.
Right.
So I mean, we were listening back then, but I think our social sensitivities weren't as sharp. And because of the lack of, or rather, how do I put this? The outrage meter wasn't near full capacity.
Mm-hmm.
That even for ourselves, that ability to self-examine what is right and wrong becomes problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even though we did an apology in 2013, I think I'm not even happy with that apology back then. Right now, with my 2019 lenses, I can look at it and go, nah, not good enough.
So I'm actually very curious about this, Elliot. What do you think changed for you between 2013 and now?
I lost my virginity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for telling the whole
Well,
world about
Yeah,
that.
of course. No, I'm very proud of it. Mum, it was a joke, Mum. No, between 2013 and 2019, I think the wokeness meter of the world just changed.
Right.
Our ability to have these conversations about race, especially in a Trumpian era, has grown quite a lot.
Right.
The way we talk about hardline racism and casual racism and microaggressions, these things I think have become more and more as a hot topic issue. Now, whether or not I do strongly believe that it was always wrong, but the ability to know what is wrong, or the ability to accept what is right now no longer acceptable, is something we have to teach people. Just like myself, right? I had to learn these things. I had to reconfigure my perspective of what it meant to be a part of a multicultural, multiracial society.
Yep. I mean,
So, yeah. So when it comes to something like that video that we did, I remember these things very clearly. Like, we had a meeting and we're like, okay, we're gonna do this video. Is there anything wrong with it? No one at the table thought there was anything wrong.
Right. But that was also because you didn't have any Indian or
Exactly.
or Malay
Representation.
people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There were no checks and balances to these things.
I mean, Willie, you also do a lot of media. You are basically a media.
You're the
producer.
media mogul of Singapore, dude.
Wow, thank you.
You are the equivalent of Harvey Weinstein, but I mean the good version,
Oh,
obviously.
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't even.
Another
use Harvey
topic for
Weinstein.
another day.
It's like the great guy.
Yeah. How? Because not only have you been in charge of some of these briefs, but you've also probably witnessed content since a much longer time. How has things changed, or like what has changed, maybe?
Good question. To be honest, I think in my, at least in my field of work, right, and the kind of videos I make, we don't actually encounter much of such cases where there's very definitive areas where you have to define race specifically. I think it's because we do a lot of corporate communication that's internal. But I do realize, and what I saw was that at some period of time, a lot of multinational companies were actually promoting a lot of diversity within their companies. And they made it a very, very strong direction in their business to ensure that people accept different people from different races, different ethnicity, different kinds of backgrounds as well. And I think that was like in the last probably about 5 to 6 years, they have been promoting this thing within their company. And I suppose it's also in their belief that diversity actually creates good ideas or great ideas, and therefore be able to progress the company, raising productivity or raising their profit or bottom line. I think this is something that I've observed, at least in the last 6 years, from really large companies.
So that actually helps a lot, because to me, every time someone asks me, why is it important that your race is represented accurately, or maybe if not accurately, at least fairly, right? What's wrong with someone making fun of an accent? What's wrong with someone making a caricature? So one of the areas that I still find a lot of difficulty in is, Michelle Chong's Letitia.
Okay.
Right? Because when you watch Letitia, you laugh, right? But actually, what are you laughing at? Are you laughing at the actual comic narrative that is undergoing, or you're laughing at the fact that Letitia, as a Filipino caricature, are we laughing at that? Right? Are we laughing at the caricature?
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic for sure. I mean, comedy, I'm going to say right now, as a comedian myself, comedy is a very tricky space.
Oh, you're a comedian?
Yeah, you guys can see my next show is on the 20th of September. If you guys are interested, let me know. Slide into my DMs. Okay. I'll get you tickets.
At 32 chances.
At 32 chances. But yeah, comedy is a very difficult line because there are low-hanging fruit jokes.
Yeah.
And those sometimes can be very racially charged,
Right.
But there are differences. I would say if you watch stuff like old school Russell Peters and compare it to like modern day Dave Chappelle, they both deal with race.
Right.
Okay, but they both deal in race in very different ways.
Right.
One is very intellectualized, and the other is Russell Peters.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just crude.
Caricatures.
It's very caricature.
Yes.
You are laughing at the accent and you're laughing at the, I suppose, the portrayal of the character.
Right.
As opposed to when you think of race as an idea, a very different way. The way Dave Chappelle talks about it, it's as though that it's about the cultural context of where he's born in, of the cultural context of what it means to be a black person in modern day America. So the way we intellectualize or talk about it. So I'm just going to go back to Letitia real quick, right, to tie this up. Letitia is interesting only because we have a lot of Filipino maids in Singapore. Yes, she is playing a role for a satirical news show. And most of the things that she deals with tends to be with the spoiled nature of Singaporeans.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So there is a fine line drawn somewhere, and I'm sure we could poke at how problematic some of these things can be. But I think the intention, and this is just a personal opinion, like the intention it's drawing with a character like Letitia is we're laughing at Singaporeans. At the way Singaporeans treat Filipino maids in Singapore, rather than her making fun of like Filipino maids just for the sake of making fun of Filipino maids.
Right.
Yeah, but the trouble is that the accent is something that she does draw back to very closely, and I think that is tricky ground. A lot of space for debate, but I think in the sake of our time for today, we might.
Yeah, I mean, just on that, Michelle Chong is as an artist and as a comedian, she has been very creative, and she's done a lot of very innovative stuff for Singapore media. So I think, when you think about a lot of her content, there is some due respect, and I hear what you're saying about how she's using Letitia almost as a pointer to Singaporeans themselves. But I think this is exactly where such conversations are important, because there are two things that happen with a caricature. The first is that is all that people know about that race or culture, right? So if someone has never actually engaged a Filipino outside of Letitia, then that's what they're going to think a Filipino is mostly about. And the second, which is not so much about racism, but I think it's valid, especially in today's time, is about seeing your own race on screen, right? There is something about, internalizing certain prejudices or internalizing certain things when you see your race being caricatured and discriminated on screen, and then you're thinking to yourself, well, what does that say about my place in society?
Right.
Right, that I don't have an actual role.
Okay, so I'm gonna play devil's advocate just for a quick bit.
Sure.
Okay. This is more of just a challenge to sentiment because so something I believe if we educated people at a general level that you just shouldn't see a caricature or you just shouldn't see a character that's being played and then assume that the entire race is like that.
Yep.
Like the diversity of your experiences will help you know, like you and I know, I mean, I'm sure Willie knows that not all Filipinos are like Letitia lah. I mean, that's just like common knowledge.
Right.
So,
you would hope so.
You would hope so. You would hope so. Exactly. I think that's the key component. If all your experiences of Filipinos was simply Letitia, then you'd be dead wrong.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean I know that Letitia is a fictional character. She's based on certain conceptions of what a maid is in reaction to the Singaporean lived experience.
Right.
But I mean I would also be I wouldn't be very smart if I were to assume that all Filipinos are like that. Right?
See, you're giving a lot of credit to a lot of people.
Right? Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, a lot of people live in very close circles. And
yes, for sure.
Actually, that's going to be a story I wanted to share about people who've lived in close circles. And this is a painful example because I think when people ask me if there's racism in Singapore, it is very obvious that the racism or the race-based engagements that I've gone through is nowhere near the level of pain that, a black person who, maybe his grandfather went through slavery, and now they are facing a very different environment in the US. It's not going to be that level, right? And so a lot of people like to do the compare and contrast. But I think race-based engagements in Singapore still happen at a level where it can be a lot and overwhelming. And that's because, for something that is, maybe race-based for a Chinese person, that becomes normalized as norms, as the majority norms, and then it just becomes norms for everyone. But then when it's something that an Indian person or a Malay person encounters, then that a lot of that burden is concentrated on that race. So I'll give an example, right? A lot of people who live in Singapore probably know a lot of these examples. For example, when you turn off the lights and people joke around and say, Rovik, where did you go, right? You disappeared, right? When it happens once, I remember when I was in primary school and it happened, I laughed. But when it happens like every month and every time the lights turn off, it gets very annoying. Because very likely I'm the only Indian person in that room because of just pure statistics. And then almost every time that happens, I'm asking myself, is this just, am I always just going to be that butt of the joke? Because the jokes that happen to everyone else, it's not really going to be race-based because no one actually makes fun of another Chinese person. It's like, haha, you Chinese, right? But when it's to do with someone from a minority race, then it becomes, the race becomes very salient, right? It becomes very obvious. And I think over time, I've found ways to navigate it, found ways to use race to my advantage. And I thought, maybe when I become an adult, maybe when I become the man that I am now, a 26-year-old, that these things won't become that much of an issue. But sadly, it still has been, right? And this happened last December when I was having drinks with a bunch of friends, and I was talking to a friend, right? She and I were just having a great chat over drinks, and her phone, and she's actually telling me, tomorrow I'm going to be the bridesmaid for a wedding. A phone call, the bride that I'm supposed to be helping out with, she's getting very nervous. And as she's saying that, actually quite coincidentally, the bride starts calling on FaceTime, right? Obviously, she needs some quick help. So my friend picks up the phone, and, the bride basically sees her friend and me, right, in frame. And I very casually say, hey, how's it going? And then I say, I'll give you guys a space. I go out, right? I come back after she's finished the call. I'm talking to her, and then all of a sudden her phone lights up. And these kind of things. I'm not trying to be intrusive, but you quickly turn to see what happened. You see the message. and basically the message said, I didn't know you hang out with Indian people or something along those lines, right? Like, oh, why are you with an Indian guy?
Jeez, that took a dark turn very fast.
Right?
Oh man, what the heck?
And my friend felt horrible, right? Because she's obviously been here with me, talking to me. She, in my mind, I don't think she's racist, right? But now all of a sudden she has to defend this friend that she's going to be a bridesmaid for, right? And her justification is, look, the two of us went through a Chinese-only school. We've never met an Indian person, right? We don't have Indian friends until we went into university, right? And that struck me because she basically admitted that for almost 12 years of her life, she just never had an Indian friend.
Right.
And very likely never had a Malay friend. Right? And for someone to go through their whole life not knowing what someone from another race could be like, and to only refer to media, it's a very dangerous proposition in Singapore.
So, Willie, do you think this can be solved with, education? Or what do you think is the solution to get people out of these closed communities? You think policy in Singapore? Like the whole idea that you need racial quotas and like in certain estates. Do you think that's one way that we solve?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, we are talking about exposure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if for example, as Rowick said, if an individual goes to school and has never been exposed, for example, to somebody of a different race, I think that that is partly that's also because it's statistical as well.
Yeah.
But there's also a certain element in which the system does not actually encourage that kind of interaction as well. And I can get behind the fact that policies such as, for example, racial quotas in, for example, housing, subsidized housing like HDBs, right, needs to happen so that we don't build specific kind of enclaves that will actually promote certain kinds of
That was
racial lines as well.
Yep.
Yeah, but of course, in the areas of school, of course, there are some schools like, I think in this case, the SIPP schools, right?
Yeah, we're going to talk about SIPP in a bit, for sure.
It will be quite tricky because they are predominantly Chinese focused. So I think
they're only Chinese focused.
Yeah. We'll go into this hot pot of an issue in a very quick bit.
Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, someone of another race can enter these schools, but
you got to learn Chinese. Yeah, you got to learn Chinese.
Of course, that deals a problem. But I suppose there's also other issues that may come about, especially when it comes to policy as well. I mean, in racial quotas in subsidized housing, that kind of makes sense. But if, for example, there were racial quotas in schools, or I would say mainstream schools, then I think that there may also be certain policies that may be more challenging, for example, to people who are in the minority. For example, if your policies, your policies, for example, is, say, if you're Indian, right, and we need to make sure that there's enough Indians in this school. I'm sorry, but your first choice to go to this school cannot happen because
of a racial.
Yeah, because we need to make sure that the other school has enough Indians or enough Malays or any other specific races.
Actually, that's a really good point because, I mean, Singapore is founded on many different principles, right? We have meritocracy as one of them. So sometimes, the best school, academically speaking, you might just want the person who's just the most qualified. Exactly. And they shouldn't be drawn on racial lines.
Already, I mean, in subsidized housing, right, making sure that certain levels and certain number of houses are dedicated to different kinds of races may be quite challenging for certain individuals. I don't want to stay here. I want to stay somewhere else.
Yeah.
Why can't I stay next to this
then
individual?
Suddenly it's just like the racial quota dictates.
Yeah,
that
the racial quota. So
Yeah.
I suppose that actually limits some of these supposed liberties as well.
It is a very tricky space.
But yet a necessary position in order to increase the amount of exposure
and
for population.
It's my turn to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
I actually don't think quotas are enough.
Yeah.
So and actually my ideal life, my ideal political reality is when the government doesn't need to intervene, right? And actually beyond quotas, I don't think the solution is more government intervention or more institutional intervention to create or force engagement. But I think the main thing with quotas, either GRC quotas or housing quotas or elected presidencies, the main thing they do is they artificialize this sense of representation or the sense of exposure, because even though my block is a diverse block, and I have I've seen my Chinese neighbors, I've seen my Malay neighbors, I don't think I go through my life knowing more about what it means to be a Malay or what it means to be a Chinese.
Right. So you're saying just because it's there doesn't mean the interaction really increases or matters. The experience might not.
Exactly. And so in the ideal world, to me, civic engagement is a lot more important. We as a community, we as people, how do we actually make it a priority for us to engage and to find people outside?
Sure.
And I think a big part of that is, finding initiative and making it a cultural habit from very early on for us to want to know about what it means to know other people. But I also think in other ways it's about tearing some of these institutional barriers down, right? So I'm personally not a fan of certain things, but that we've come to accept as norms. But those are things that we can talk about as well.
At a macro level, I think we all can agree it's very tricky.
It is.
Yeah, it's very tricky for us to even have. I mean, three of us are definitely not going to come up with a policy solution tonight. I know that much.
Wait,
my IQ is about my shoe size in US numbers.
Those are huge shoes.
I've prepared a whole policy dossier here for you to discuss.
I don't understand anything, dude.
Right.
I just know if someone tells me like, hey, I feel this, I feel that. I mean, at a personal level, I can agree with a lot of things. So anyway, I want to bring our attention. We kind of mentioned this already.
Sure.
But the one thing which we probably could agree upon is, why does this thing still exist?
Right.
SAP schools.
Right.
SIPP schools. I was from a SIPP school. I did.
Well, what does SAP stand for? Special Assistance Plan. Sorry, I asked
put me in the spot. Then I was like, "Ayo, now I'm really stupid." I can't believe I went there and I still didn't know.
Right.
Hey, that's kind of racist, isn't it?
Right. Doing a Valley Girl accent.
Yeah, man, that's me. But I really had no idea what it was. All I knew growing up, I was in Maristella for about 10 years.
Right.
Was that I had one Indian friend in my entire school. And he had to learn Chinese. There was no ifs and or buts about it. He had to learn Chinese.
Right.
I never questioned it, not until much, much later in my life.
Yep.
When I was 17 and I was hanging out with my friend. His name's Arun. He's a great guy.
Shout out to Arun.
Shout out to Arun in Glasgow.
Hey.
We were hanging out, and then we spoke Chinese sometimes, as we do.
Right.
And then Arun joined in the conversation, and one of our non-mutual friends, a friend from outside these circles, we were like, "Damn, Arun speaks Chinese." I was like, "Yeah, he speaks Chinese. What's the big deal?"
Yeah.
And it's like, "Man, this is a special one." And then when he said he's a special one, I was like, "No, he's just a normal dude, man. Like, I know this guy my whole life. He's a normal dude." But it makes you feel something different, that we kind of coerce. And they asked him, "Arun, do you speak Tamil?" Then he says, "Nah, man, I never grew up learning Tamil at all."
Right.
And then it hit me like, man, we can't, not that we coerced this man into doing this, but there was a system in place that, just, he didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
I realized he never had a choice in doing this just because he wanted to go to a seemingly good school like Maristella High.
Right. So it's
a great school.
It's probably worth talking a bit very quickly about the history of the special assistance.
Sure,
right?
please, go ahead.
So this program started in 1979. And actually, the thing about the special assistance plan is that theoretically it is for all languages, all cultures. Meaning that, if you want to create a school under the special assistance plan for the Indian culture and language, theoretically this plan will support that, right? It's just so happened that all of the schools under this are the Chinese schools. And that is because of a couple of reasons. The first is because of the people that backed a lot of these schools who were Chinese philanthropists.
Right.
And their intent was to create an environment where Chinese values and Chinese culture was predominantly the focus. And because they wanted to invest into their community, right?
Right.
It's not to say that there was a lack of effort on the other communities' part, but purely because of circumstance and purely because of that time in which a lot of this was happening, the special assistance plan was very attractive for the Chinese community. And I actually, personally, in 1979, I don't think it was a bad idea, right? And I think, you know, the key thing about this is that it's normally starts at secondary school level. The only requirement is that you take that one language. So for
and this is so you're telling me that it's more about preserving a certain kind of cultural value.
Right.
Back in the old school 70s.
Yep.
You know, they had this scheme to say like, hey, we really want
like
Chinese
the 80s, yeah.
The 80s, right? We want like Chinese culture to be preserved in a certain way, certain places to champion. I can tell you for like Maria Stella, our key motto was 勤勉中勇, which kind of like translates into like our diligence, being like hardworking, being respectful, being courageous. Right. So these were things that they kind of like ingrained into us that all the big brothers who once were part of this school, you know, we all championed those causes. But so you're telling me that was part of it?
And it was to the point where back in the day, all classes were taught in Mandarin.
Yeah.
So so it means that if you join this school, you are going to leave graduating hardcore Chinese speaking.
Well, they failed on me.
Well, so this was back in the day, right? And this is a point of origin. But as time went on and as bilingualism became important, then and I guess also there was a recognition that English was
the examination language became English eventually, right?
So English became a thing. But what happened was that, you know, a couple of things happened, right? The first is that these schools are good schools because of the resourcing that came from the foundations, from the philanthropists, compared to a lot of public schools.
So this was privately funded in some sense.
For a lot of them, right? Not all of them, but for a lot of them.
Right.
And so as a result, these resources were concentrated.
Gotcha.
Right? And the people who graduated with these resources, who had, you know, a better chance at doing well, not just in school, but potentially in their career, they went their whole lives basically not ever engaging someone from another race.
Right.
And to them, their reality was, all I know is Chinese culture, all I know is Chinese values, and I have no opposition to any of that. But the question mark that I think all of us have been asking is, well, then what happens next? Right.
Do we need I don't know, like, do we need special funding for these schools anymore? Is a big question for me.
Right.
Well, like, if now we truly believe in the meritocratic system that is, you know, the Singapore educational system, do we give extra money? Because now it's no longer private. I mean, SAP is not like privately funded, right? These are schools that are getting extra resources just because they're SAP.
And so in 1979, when MOE designated its schools, they were given additional teaching resources so that, you know, they get a lower student to teacher ratio, they get more assistance, and it was targeted at top scoring students as well.
So this could come down. I don't know. Willie, maybe you want to chime in on like whether you think this is a systemic kind of issue. Like, do you think it produces a systemic issue?
I think definitely. I mean, in its own origin, or the origin of its premise is to preserve a culture, right? And I think this is really a very difficult subject to tackle.
No doubt.
I mean, on one hand, definitely an individual who goes through such SAP school is not going to be interacting necessarily with another person in front, just like yourself.
Yeah, just like myself, dude.
I mean,
absolutely.
You have one friend, right?
I had one friend until I was like 17.
Right. And of course, this definitely, whether the person likes it or not, will not be exposed to somebody else of a different race. And I think that already creates a problem. But then on the other hand, I mean, you have concerned parents who want to make sure that certain values are being imparted for their children, right? That's why they send them, or highly recommend that their children actually send them for such schools, right? So I suppose these things might be competing values in society sometimes, right? Definitely the specific kind of work ethics or perspectives in, for example, like in certain Chinese schools like Confucianism or things like that, versus, for example, the belief that diversity is an acceptance for diversity is a very important thing. So I think that maybe it might be a case of changing the SAP schools to be more diverse. That could be one perspective, but then
so
again,
they have done that. You know, they've actually because there was parliamentary questions raised.
Right.
And SIPP School started creating, during racial harmony day, what happens, right? that's a big question.
It's like all these Chinese people in the school.
Right. Or like, okay, where's the racial harmony, right? And so they actually try to bring, they try to do cross-school events. They try to do, let's spend a day thinking and talking about another race. But the reality is that, social norms don't happen like that.
It might not happen. It might not be enough, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. And actually, Minister of Education Ong Lee Kang had to deal with this question quite recently, I think maybe a year or 2 years ago. And he continued to stand by them, even despite all the criticism, because, as you mentioned, the importance of Chinese values to this community was so strong.
Right.
But here's my question, right? And it's not a criticism as much as it's a genuine curiosity, right? Are we okay with the downstream effects of that, right?
I tell you one thing I'm not okay with, only is just that extra funding component. Because I believe in meritocracy, right? Like, I strongly believe in it. And no school should have more money than another, just from like the government itself.
Yeah, and a school that actually, quite honestly, by definition, discriminates.
Yeah. I mean, like, at the school, once you take Chinese as a language, if you can accept that premise, then great lah. I mean, like, you want to go to school that teaches you Chinese, to me, that's fair.
Right.
But you don't get extra money for doing that, then it kind of makes it so that you are disadvantaged by not going to that school and doing that thing.
Yep.
I think that's the problem. The problem is by not being a part of that culture or not subscribing to it, you are literally financially and educationally disadvantaged.
Yep.
That to me has no place in a meritocratic world.
Right.
Yeah.
There is a wider conversation around, unequal funding for schools, right? Because you have schools like Raffles that has a lot of donor funding as well.
Yeah.
But I think when you think about, race-based admissions, or rather language-based admissions, but it's so implicitly tied that you can't, it's a bit naive to say like, no, it's just language, right?
Yeah. No. I mean, like, culturally as well, because the people who are all there, they have this old boys thing. Right? I know in Maristella there's this old boys thing. My father went to Maristella. My grandfather went to Maristella. Like, your whole family had to go to Maristella. Yeah, no, I mean, like, your whole family had to go to Maristella, you know.
Right.
And if you didn't go, you're like, wow, you're really disrespecting the forefathers, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I came from a totally different school background, right? And I'm just trying to double check that my school is definitely not an SAP school.
It's not.
It's definitely not.
Okay, well,
I mean, at least in the context of whatever this article is writing.
Right.
In fact, I think in my school, it's I think the different races are actually celebrated. In fact, some of the top performing people in specific areas actually happen to be different races of minority. Like I remember back in when we had, for example, rugby games, right? The best player was this Indian chap. He could take on 5 guys on his legs and cross the line.
If you tell us rugby, right, everyone will know what school you're from already, dude. Like, there's no hiding it already.
Yeah. So I actually see the merit of having diversity in the school. It really, really helps to normalize the conversation. It really helps to say that you're so used to talking to somebody of different race, and it doesn't really impact. Yeah. And I see, well, as much as certain cultures in an SAP school may be Chinese values, for example, may be permeated, or an individual may be inculcated, but he may be missing another facet of his life, which is learning how to, for example, see diversity as something that's normal, see diversity as something that's of strength. That's very common as well. And I think definitely that there is a problem with regards to exposure.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is a nuanced way of saying it, but I believe in this. I'm more likely to subscribe to an identity of a Singaporean, which is more like multiculturally diverse, religiously more diverse, as I am like a Chinese guy, you know? So like, I know what Chinese values are. I mean, I grew up in a traditional Chinese family, but I also like to think that I'm learning from everyone around me. Because as a Singaporean, we're not like 5 different races.
Maybe I could just point out something. I that's my own opinion. Is that now that we talked about the identity of a Singaporean, right? What exactly is a Singaporean identity that's exclusive from somebody else or another country, for example? And maybe we can even address, for example, what exactly is racism in Singapore as well. Like, for example, if we have for example, other races from different parts of Southeast Asia or different
so beyond the CMIO.
Beyond the CMIO, coming and integrating within Singapore, for example, is that a dilution of our Singapore heritage and culture? Or is this a conversation of expanding our identity?
That's interesting.
We've actually engaged this topic a couple of times on this podcast.
Yes. That's interesting. Yesterday even, we're recording this a day after the National Day rally speech. And even yesterday, I think PM Lee kind of talked a little bit about how every generation, we are made out of so many different identities. Many different generations of people who are moving to Singapore for their hopes and aspirations and realizing their own dreams. And they've all sort of like left their mark over here. It's I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but it seems like an expansive idea of what it means to be Singaporean. Not this very narrow-minded way of thinking about it.
It's a huge conversation, but I think the principles of engagement need to be consistent, right? And I think they can be consistent. And that is, how do we engage with people from other races? How do we talk about race-based topics and racism, right? I feel like what I've heard again and again throughout these conversations, but also, in general, when you see what goes wrong with some of these interactions online, it's a lot of people don't listen, right? So you start with listen, actually taking the time to pause and say, all right, like, let me hear what you have to say. Let me acknowledge that it is, your reality. And then to ask questions, right? Like, what happened? Why do you feel this way? What did I do that, triggered this?
It's an examination, right?
Right.
Of the self.
And it's not to, I think the goal isn't to find blame. I think the goal is to understand. And then to finally, try to reconcile or find some kind of remediation, right? And sometimes that could mean saying sorry, like either sorry that I didn't know that this would cause this, and like, I'm sorry that happened. Or, if you actually did something wrong with intent to do something wrong, then hopefully you have the courage to walk it back and to try to be better about it. Right? And I think with a lot of these things, it takes humility. It takes an appreciation that the whole is better than the parts, right? To say that it's not just about being defensive, but it's about, I recognize that this is something that we're norming, right? I think one thing that we all talked about a lot was context and intent, right? A lot of times, a very quick way to analyze actually what went wrong is to say, okay, what was the context of what was said, right? And the second thing is, what was the intent? Was the intent to hurt, or was the intent actually, no, I want to do something else, and unfortunately this was collateral damage, right? And so in that case, how do I acknowledge the hurt but still work forward?
I think it does require some mature conversation, some level of civility, open-mindedness, like a bit of honest conversation. I think it's not always, it's easy to say, but in the practicals of it, sometimes you get lost in emotion and stuff. Well, that was a very heavy episode. Thank you guys for sticking around.
All right.
And talking to us about this. Leave your questions. If you guys have any comments, please drop us in the comment section below. We haven't been reading much of
sections below.
Yeah, we haven't been reading much of the live chat today.
Yeah, but
we're so into it.
Yeah. If you found this useful, and if you found this way of exploring racism useful, let me ask that you share this, right? In a way that actually starts the conversation and gets people to talk about how we talk about racism in our own communities. Because I don't think it happens enough. I don't think at the workplace, I don't think in our communities, in our families.
Not on YouTube.
Yeah. That we even know what it means to talk about racism.
Heck yeah.
It's not as scary. It's not as scary as it should be, right? Sorry, it's not as scary as it is, because at the end of the day, people do want to lean in and deal with it and actually live their life not caring about racism, right? Like actually dealing.
We're not that unapathetic as people carve it out to be sometimes.
It's true.
All right, cool. So on that note, next week's the following week's episode is going to be a bit more chill.
Yeah, it's about art and being artsy.
Oh, wow, cool.
Hey, this is where I can bring in my. You guys should tune in for the live show because I will do a drawing on air.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Live drawing? You can draw?
Hey, man, you haven't seen my
I
stuff.
learned so much things about you.
I hope
comedian.
it's not a nude drawing.
It's going to be a nude drawing. Like, you guys watch Titanic? Paint me like one of your French girls? That one? I'm going to do that.
Is that a French accent?
That's racist.
What the It was the show. Oh, great. I'm just in all sorts of hot soup after this episode. But yeah, I'm going to do the Paint me like one of your French girls thing. One of you guys will have to be my model.
Right,
And
Willy Wonka volunteered.
right.
One of you guys. I'll give you guys a pearl
I'll
necklace to wear.
volunteer my
and that's about
hamster. Okay.
it. Nice. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. We're going to sign off here. So that's me, Elliot.
Rovik.
And Willie?
All right. And that's all for
Goodbye.
tonight. Good night.
Good night, everyone.